chapters 21 through 30 of Against Celsus, Book 2 by Origen. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Observe also the superficiality and manifest falsity of such a statement of Celsus when he asserts, quote, that he who was partaker of a man's table would not conspire against him, and if he would not conspire against a man, much less would he plot against a god after banqueting with him. End quote. For who does not know that many persons, after partaking of the salt on the table, have entered into a conspiracy against their entertainers? The whole of Greek and barbarian history is full of such instances, and the iambic poet of Paros, when upbraiding Lycambus with having violated covenants confirmed by the salt of the table, says to him, quote, but thou hast broken a mighty oath, that, viz., by the salt of the table, end quote. And they who are interested in historical learning, and who give themselves wholly to it, to the neglect of other branches of knowledge more necessary for the conduct of life, can quote numerous instances showing that they who shared in the hospitality of others entered into conspiracies against them. He adds to this, as if he had brought together an argument with conclusive demonstrations and consequences, the following, quote, and, which is still more absurd, God himself conspired against those who sat at his table by converting them into traitors and impious men, end quote. But how Jesus could either conspire or convert his disciples into traitors or impious men, it would be impossible for him to prove, save by means of such a deduction as any one could refute with the greatest ease. He continues in this strain, quote, if he had determined upon these things and underwent chastisement in obedience to his Father, it is manifest that, being a God and submitting voluntarily, those things which were done agreeably to his own decision were neither painful nor distressing. End quote. But he did not observe that here he was at once contradicting himself, for if he granted that he was chastised because he had determined upon these things and had submitted himself to his Father, it is clear that he actually suffered punishment, and it was impossible that what was inflicted on him by his chastisers should not be painful, because pain is an involuntary thing. But if, because he was willing to suffer, his inflictions were neither painful nor distressing, how did he grant that, quote, he was chastised, end quote? He did not perceive that when Jesus had once by his birth assumed a body, he assumed one which was capable both of suffering pains and those distresses incidental to humanity, if we are to understand by distresses what no one voluntarily chooses. Since, therefore, he voluntarily assumed a body not wholly of a different nature from that of human flesh, so along with his body he assumed also its sufferings and distresses, which it was not in his power to avoid enduring, it being in the power of those who inflicted them to send upon him things distressing and painful. And in the preceding pages we have already shown that he would not have come into the hands of men had he not so willed. But he did come because he was willing to come, and because it was manifest beforehand that his dying upon behalf of men would be of advantage to the whole human race. After this, wishing to prove that the occurrences which befell him were painful and distressing, and that it was impossible for him, had he wished, to render them otherwise, he proceeds, quote, why does he mourn and lament and pray to escape the fear of death, expressing himself in terms like these, O Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, end quote. Now in these words observe the malignity of Celsus, how not accepting the love of truth which actuates the writers of the Gospels, who might have passed over in silence those points which, as Celsus thinks, are censurable, but who did not omit them for many reasons, which any one in expounding the Gospel can give in their proper place, he brings an accusation against the Gospel statement, grossly exaggerating the facts, and quoting what is not written in the Gospels, seeing it is nowhere found that Jesus lamented, and he changes the words in the expression, quote, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, end quote, and does not give what follows immediately after, which manifests at once the ready obedience of Jesus to his Father and his greatness of mind, and which runs thus, quote, Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt, end quote. Nay, even the cheerful obedience of Jesus to the will of his Father in those things which he was condemned to suffer, exhibited in the declaration, quote, If this cup cannot pass from me except I drink it, thy will be done, end quote. He pretends not to have observed, acting here like those wicked individuals who listen to the Holy Scriptures in a malignant spirit and, quote, who talk wickedness with lofty head, end quote, for they appear to have heard the declaration, quote, I kill, end quote, and they often make it to us a subject of reproach, but the words, quote, I will make alive, end quote, they do not remember. The whole sentence showing that those who live amid public wickedness and who work wickedly are put to death by God, and that a better life is infused into them instead, even one which God will give to those who have died to sin. And so also these men have heard the words, quote, I will smite, end quote, but they do not see these, quote, and I will heal, end quote, which are like the words of a physician who cuts bodies asunder and inflicts severe wounds in order to extract from them substances that are injurious and prejudicial to health, and who does not terminate his work with pains and lacerations, but by his treatment restores the body to that state of soundness which he has in view. Moreover, they have not heard the whole of the announcement, quote, For he maketh sore, and again bindeth up, end quote, but only this part, quote, He maketh sore, end quote. So in like manner acts this Jew of Celsus, who quotes the words, quote, O Father, would that this cup might pass from me, end quote, but who does not add what follows, and which exhibits the firmness of Jesus and his preparedness for suffering. But these matters, which afford great room for explanation from the wisdom of God, and which may reasonably be pondered over by those whom Paul calls perfect when he says, quote, We speak wisdom among them who are perfect, end quote, we pass by for the present, and shall speak for a little of those matters which are useful for our present purpose. We have mentioned in the preceding pages that there are some of the declarations of Jesus which refer to that being in him which was the, quote, firstborn of every creature, end quote, such as, quote, I am the way, and the truth, and the life, end quote, and such like, and others again which belong to that in him which is understood to be man, such as, quote, But now ye seek to kill me, a man that hath told you the truth which I have heard of the Father, end quote. And here, accordingly, he describes the element of weakness belonging to human flesh, and that of readiness of spirit which existed in his humanity. The element of weakness in the expression, quote, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, end quote. The readiness of the spirit in this, quote, Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt, end quote. And since it is proper to observe the order of our quotations, observe that, in the first place, there is mentioned only the single instance, as one would say, indicating the weakness of the flesh, and afterwards those other instances, greater in number, manifesting the willingness of the spirit. For the expression, quote, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, end quote, is only one, whereas more numerous are those others, viz., quote, Not as I will, but as thou wilt, end quote, and, quote, O my Father, if this cup cannot pass from me except I drink it, thy will be done, end quote. It is to be noted also that the words are not, Let this cup depart from me, but that the whole expression is marked by a tone of piety and reverence, quote, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, end quote. I know, indeed, that there is another explanation of this passage to the following effect. The Saviour, foreseeing the sufferings which the Jewish people and the city of Jerusalem were to undergo in requital of the wicked deeds which the Jews had dared to perpetrate upon him, from no other motive than that of the purest philanthropy towards them, and from a desire that they might escape the impending calamities, gave utterance to the prayer, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. It is as if he had said, quote, because of my drinking this cup of punishment, the whole nation will be forsaken by thee. I pray, if it be possible, that this cup may pass from me, in order that thy portion, which was guilty of such crimes against me, may not be altogether deserted by thee. End quote. But if, as Celsus would allege, quote, nothing at that time was done to Jesus which was either painful or distressing, end quote, how could men afterwards quote the example of Jesus as enduring sufferings for the sake of religion, if he did not suffer what are human sufferings, but only had the appearance of so doing? This Jew of Celsus still accuses the disciples of Jesus of having invented these statements, saying to them, quote, even although guilty of falsehood, ye have not been able to give a color of credibility to your investigations, end quote. In answer to which, we have to say that there was an easy method of concealing these occurrences, that, viz., of not recording them at all. For if the Gospels had not contained the accounts of these things, who could have reproached us with Jesus having spoken such words during his stay upon earth? Celsus, indeed, did not see that it was an inconsistency for the same persons both to be deceived regarding Jesus, believing him to be God and the subject of prophecy, and to invent fictions about him, knowing manifestly that these statements were false. Of a truth, therefore, they were not guilty of inventing untruths, but such were their real impressions, and they recorded them truly, or else they were guilty of falsifying the histories, and did not entertain these views, and were not deceived when they acknowledged him to be God. After this he says that certain of the Christian believers, like persons who in a fit of drunkenness lay violent hands upon themselves, have corrupted the gospel from its original integrity to a threefold and fourfold and manyfold degree, and have remodeled it so that they might be able to answer objections. Now I know of no others who have altered the gospel, save the followers of Marcion and those of Valentinus, and, I think, also those of Lucian. But such an allegation is no charge against the Christian system, but against those who dared so to trifle with the Gospels. And as it is no ground of accusation against philosophy that there exist sophists, or Epicureans, or Peripatetics, or any others, who they may be, who hold false opinions, so neither is it against genuine Christianity that there are some who corrupt the gospel histories and who introduce heresies opposed to the meaning of the doctrine of Jesus. And since this Jew of Celsus makes it a subject of reproach that Christians should make use of the prophets who predicted the events of Christ's life, we have to say, in addition to what we have already advanced upon this head, that it became him to spare individuals, as he says, and to expound the prophecies themselves, and, after admitting the probability of the Christian interpretation of them, to show how the use which they make of them may be overturned. For in this way he would not appear hastily to assume so important a position on small grounds, and particularly when he asserts that the, quote, prophecies agree with 10,000 other things more credibly than with Jesus, end quote, and he ought to have carefully met this powerful argument of the Christians as being the strongest which they adduce, and to have demonstrated with regard to each particular prophecy that it can apply to other events with greater probability than to Jesus. He did not, however, perceive that this was a plausible argument to be advanced against the Christians only by one who was an opponent of the prophetic writings. But Celsus has here put in the mouth of a Jew an objection which a Jew would not have made. For a Jew will not admit that the prophecies may be applied to countless other things with greater probability than to Jesus, but he will endeavor, after giving what appears to him the meaning of each, to oppose the Christian interpretation, not indeed by any means adducing convincing reasons, but only attempting to do so. In the preceding pages we have already spoken of this point, viz., the prediction that there were to be two advents of Christ to the human race, so that it is not necessary for us to reply to the objection supposed to be urged by a Jew that, quote, the prophets declare the coming one to be a mighty potentate, Lord of all nations and armies, end quote. But it is in the spirit of a Jew, I think, and in keeping with their bitter animosity and baseless and even improbable calumnies against Jesus, that he adds, quote, nor did the prophets predict such a pestilence, end quote. For neither Jews, nor Celsus, nor any other can bring any argument to prove that a pestilence converts men from the practice of evil to a life which is according to nature and distinguished by temperance and other virtues. This objection also is cast in our teeth by Celsus, quote, from such signs and misinterpretations, and from proofs so mean, no one could prove him to be God and the Son of God, end quote. Now it was his duty to enumerate the alleged misinterpretations, and to prove them to be such, and to show by reasoning the meanness of the evidence, in order that the Christian, if any of his objections should seem to be plausible, might be able to answer and confute his arguments. What he said, however, regarding Jesus, did indeed come to pass, because he was a mighty potentate, although Celsus refuses to see that it so happened, notwithstanding that the clearest evidence proves it true of Jesus, quote, for as the sun, he says, which enlightens all other objects, first makes himself visible, so ought the Son of God to have done, end quote. We would say in reply that so he did, for righteousness has arisen in his days, and there is abundance of peace, which took its commencement at his birth, God preparing the nations for his teaching, that they might be under one prince, the king of the Romans, and that it might not, owing to the want of union among the nations, caused by the existence of many kingdoms, be more difficult for the apostles of Jesus to accomplish the task enjoined upon them by their master when he said, quote, go and teach all nations, end quote. Moreover, it is certain that Jesus was born in the reign of Augustus, who, so to speak, fused together into one monarchy the many populations of the earth. Now the existence of many kingdoms would have been a hindrance to the spread of the doctrine of Jesus throughout the entire world, not only for the reasons mentioned, but also on account of the necessity of men everywhere engaging in war and fighting on behalf of their native country, which was the case before the times of Augustus, and in the periods still more remote, when necessity arose, as when the Peloponnesians and Athenians warred against each other and other nations in like manner. How then was it possible for the gospel doctrine of peace, which does not permit men to take vengeance even upon enemies, to prevail throughout the world, unless at the advent of Jesus a milder spirit had been everywhere introduced into the conduct of things? End of chapters 21 through 30 of Against Celsus, Book 2, by Origen, read by David Ronald.